The public urinal stood 1.4 meters tall at the basin rim. I found the photograph in March 2024, archived in Vienna's municipal records under street fixtures, circa 1872. The man beside it barely reached the upper edge, average height for his era, yet dwarfed by a facility supposedly built for him. But the proportions were not the strangest detail. The urinal connected to a sewage network dated 1843. Vienna's district where it stood was not developed until 1867. The sanitation infrastructure existed 24 years before the neighborhood it served. These toilets were not built for us. They were built before us. I began examining European sanitation records systematically in April 2024. The pattern that emerged defied conventional explanation on two fronts. The fixtures were too large for their users, and they predated the cities they served. The Vienna photograph introduced both anomalies simultaneously. The basin height of 1.4 meters exceeded ergonomic standards by approximately 45 centimeters. Victorian sanitary engineering manuals, including George Jennings' 1852 treatise on public conveniences, specified optimal basin heights between 0.85 and 0.95 meters for standing male facilities. These measurements reflected the average European male height of 1.65 to 1.68 meters. The Vienna installation ignored these guidelines entirely, but the temporal displacement troubled me more. The Leopoldstadt district where the urinal stood was developed between 1867 and 1875 as part of Vienna's Ringstrasse expansion. City planning documents from the Wiener Stadt- und Landesarchiv confirmed the development timeline. Yet the sewage connection point beneath the urinal dated to 1843, carved into the stone base, visible in the original photograph. The infrastructure preceded the neighborhood by nearly a quarter century. I searched for explanations. Perhaps the date marked a different event, a renovation, a survey marker, an unrelated inscription. The stone carving showed no ambiguity. The numerals were consistent with 1840s masonry technique. The connection point itself showed weathering patterns indicating decades of exposure before the metal superstructure was installed above it. Someone had built sanitation infrastructure in 1843 for a district that would not exist until 1867. Someone had known where Vienna would expand before Vienna's planners made that decision. A survey document from 1865, 2 years before the Leopoldstadt development began, referenced existing drainage points requiring integration into planned construction. The surveyor noted that connection infrastructure appeared to anticipate the approved street grid, despite predating official planning by at least 2 decades. His observation received no elaboration in subsequent documents. The mystery was acknowledged and then ignored. I examined similar records from Paris. The Haussmann renovation of the 1850s and 1860s transformed medieval Paris into the modern city. Official history credits Baron Haussmann with revolutionary urban planning, new boulevards, new sewers, new public facilities. The records told a more complicated story. A survey from 1851, before Haussmann's appointment, documented pre-existing sanitation connection points throughout areas marked for future development. The points were positioned along street alignments that would not be approved until 1854. They connected to sewer lines that official records dated to the 1830s, infrastructure built for a city layout that did not yet exist. The fixtures installed above these connection points showed the same dimensional anomalies I had found in Vienna. Basin heights of 1.37 meters, partition heights exceeding 2 meters, proportions designed for users significantly taller than any documented Parisian demographic. I measured photographs from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France using architectural scale references. The men photographed beside the pissoirs appeared strained, stretched upward to use facilities that did not accommodate their bodies. A cartoon from Le Charivari in 1876 depicted a man standing on a wooden crate to reach a public urinal. The humor acknowledged what official records did not explain. The proportions were wrong, and no one could say why. A journalist named Marcel Dubois wrote about the pissoirs for Le Petit Journal in 1879. His article mentioned that certain facilities had been discovered rather than constructed during the Haussmann works. The engineers had found connection points already positioned, already sized, already waiting for the superstructures that would be installed decades after the underground components were built. Discovered. The word implied prior existence. Someone had built the foundations before the city arrived to use them. I compiled height measurements from 6 European capitals. The consistency was unsettling. Vienna, 1.38 to 1.42 meters, predating documented development by 15 to 30 years. Paris, 135 to 140 meters, connection points preceding street layouts by 20 to 25 years. Brussels, 134 to 1.38 meters, infrastructure dated 1847 for districts developed after 1870. Berlin, 136 to 141 meters, sanitation networks anticipating urban expansion by decades. London, 132 to 1.38 meters, discovered infrastructure predating Victorian development programs. St. Petersburg, 139 to 144 meters, systems built for districts not yet planned. The oversizing matched the temporal displacement. The same facilities that were too tall for their users also predated the neighborhoods they served. 2 anomalies, 1 pattern, no explanation. The Brussels documentation provided the clearest evidence of advanced planning. The city archives contained survey records from 1842 that mapped sanitation connection points across undeveloped land east of the Seine River. The area would not be urbanized until 1871. Yet precise infrastructure positions appeared on maps drawn 30 years before construction began. I examined the 1842 survey in the Archives de la Ville de Bruxelles. The document showed connection points at intervals of exactly 847 meters, a spacing I had encountered before in underground infrastructure research. The points were positioned along streets that did not exist, in districts that had not been planned, for a city expansion that would not be approved until 1868. The surveyor, a municipal engineer named Henri Claessens, noted the following in his report. Connection infrastructure of unknown origin, positioned with precision suggesting foreknowledge of future development patterns. Recommend integration rather than removal. His recommendation was followed. The connection points became the foundation of Brussels' Eastern Sanitation Network. Foreknowledge. The word appeared in an official municipal document from 1842. A government engineer acknowledged that someone had built infrastructure anticipating development patterns 3 decades in advance. The acknowledgement received no investigation. The mystery was recorded and then buried in archival files. The fixtures installed above these connection points in the 1870s matched the oversized proportions found across Europe. Basin heights of 1.36 meters, partition heights of 2.1 meters. A municipal photograph from 1882 showed a Brussels policeman standing beside a public urinal, his head barely reaching the privacy partition designed for someone at least 20 centimeters taller. I calculated the implied user height from the fixture proportions. The basin height of 1.36 meters corresponded to comfortable use by someone approximately 1.95 meters tall. The partition height of 2.1 meters provided adequate privacy for someone exceeding 2 meters. No documented European population averaged these heights in the 19th century. No documented European population averaged these heights in any century for which records existed. Yet the fixtures were standardized across the continent. Separate engineers in separate countries with no documented communication installed facilities with identical specifications, specifications designed for users who did not match any recorded demographic, built on foundations that predated the cities they served. A maintenance report from Brussels in 1891 described the installation of wooden step platforms at the base of Eastern District urinals. The platforms were listed as accessibility modifications to accommodate users of normal stature. Normal stature. The phrase implied that the original design anticipated abnormal stature. Taller users. Users who either no longer existed or had never been officially documented. The platforms remained in place until the fixtures were removed in 1924. 33 years of accommodation for a design error that spanned a continent. No engineer was disciplined. No design review was conducted. The anomaly was simply worked around as if the mistake was not a mistake at all. I found similar accommodation records in London. The Metropolitan Board of Works authorized step platform installation at 47 public urinals in 1878. The authorization document noted that original fixture heights did not correspond to surveyed user demographics and recommended mechanical modification rather than fixture replacement. The original heights were preserved. The platforms made them usable. The fixtures remained too tall. The infrastructure remained too old. And the official records remained silent on who had built systems for cities that did not yet exist, sized for users who did not yet walk their streets. An atlas from 1745, preserved in the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, labeled the territories containing Vienna, Paris, Brussels, and Berlin as the western edge of Grande Tartarie. By 1830, the label had vanished from European cartography. The lands remained. The name disappeared. The oversized, temporally displaced sanitation infrastructure appeared within decades of the cartographic revision. I noted the correlation without adopting a conclusion. Maps do not build toilets. Cartographic labels do not determine fixture heights. But the pattern persisted. Infrastructure built before cities existed, sized for users who did not match recorded populations, appearing in regions once labeled with a name that history had erased. The temporal paradox deepened when I examined urban planning records. The sanitation infrastructure did not merely predate city development. It appeared to have guided it. In Vienna, the Leopoldstadt street grid followed the pre-existing connection point positions with remarkable precision. I overlaid the 1843 infrastructure map onto the 1867 development plan. The alignment was exact. Streets curved to meet connection points. Intersections formed at predetermined junction locations. The urban plan conformed to sanitation infrastructure rather than the reverse. A planning document from 1866 contained a revealing notation. An engineer named Karl Brenner had written alignment to existing subterranean infrastructure required per municipal directive. The directive was not attached. The source of the requirement was not specified. Brenner's note acknowledged that city planning followed predetermined positions rather than functional urban design principles. Paris showed the same pattern. Haussmann's famous boulevards, celebrated as revolutionary urban planning, followed connection point positions documented in surveys from the 1830s. The Boulevard de Sebastopol ran directly over a sanitation line dated 1834, 20 years before Haussmann approved the street's alignment. The Avenue de l'Opéra intersected junction points installed in 1841, 13 years before the avenue was planned. Official history credits Haussmann with designing modern Paris. The infrastructure suggested he was adapting to constraints that predated his authority. The city did not follow his vision. His vision followed the pipes. I searched for evidence of the original builders. The infrastructure had been constructed. Someone had determined the positions, calculated the spacing, anticipated the urban expansion patterns. Yet no construction record survived from the 1830s and 1840s, documenting who had built these systems or why. Renovation records existed in abundance. Removal records documented systematic dismantlement between 1890 and 1930, but original construction records, blueprints, contracts, labor documentation, had vanished from every archive I consulted. A Paris archivist suggested the documents might have been destroyed during the Commune uprising of 1871. A Vienna archivist proposed wartime losses. A Brussels historian speculated administrative negligence. Each explanation was plausible individually. Collectively, they formed a pattern of absence too consistent to be coincidental. The same categories of documents were missing across 6 countries. Construction records for temporarily displaced infrastructure, design specifications for oversized fixtures, any documentation explaining who had built systems for cities that did not yet exist. Only the removal records survived, meticulous documentation of dismantlement, extraction, and erasure. The removal followed a precise timeline. Between 1890 and 1930, municipal authorities across Europe systematically replaced the oversized, temporarily displaced fixtures with standard height facilities positioned according to contemporary street layouts. Paris began in 1898. A renovation order authorized replacement of inherited sanitation fixtures throughout the eastern arrondissements. The order specified that new installations would follow current demographic measurements rather than historical specifications. The language acknowledged what official history did not explain. The original specifications had not reflected the population they served. Vienna followed in 1901, Brussels in 1899, London in 1904, Berlin in 1902, St. Petersburg in 1907. The coordination was implicit. No international body mandated the changes. No treaty required standardization. Yet 6 capitals undertook identical programs within a 9-year window. The connection points were dug up and destroyed. The stone bases were broken apart. The metal superstructures were scrapped. Photographs from the period showed workers demolishing infrastructure that had stood for decades, sometimes centuries. Infrastructure that had guided city development, anticipated population growth, and waited for civilizations to arrive. A Vienna newspaper published a letter in 1903 questioning the demolition. The writer asked why ancient infrastructure of such evident quality was being destroyed rather than preserved for historical study. The municipal response stated that modernization required complete replacement. The ancient infrastructure, predating the cities it served by decades, was eliminated without investigation. Something had been built before the cities existed. Something had been sized for users who did not match recorded populations. And when the discrepancy became impossible to ignore, the evidence was systematically destroyed. I returned to the original Vienna photograph in October 2024. The image now represented more than dimensional anomaly. It captured a moment when the temporal paradox was still visible, before the removal programs erased the evidence. The urinal stood 1.4 meters at the basin rim, connected to infrastructure dated 1843, in a district developed in 1867, photographed in 1872. The man beside it reached barely to the upper edge, average height for his era, using a facility built for someone taller, in a neighborhood built around sanitation infrastructure that had waited 24 years for its arrival. The fixture existed before the district. The district conformed to the fixture. And the fixture's proportions suggested it had not been designed for anyone who lived in the district once it was built. I compiled the evidence into 2 categories: temporal displacement and dimensional anomaly. Both pointed toward the same conclusion. The infrastructure was not designed by 19th century engineers for 19th century populations. It was inherited, discovered, adapted. The Tartarian hypothesis offered a framework for interpretation. Regions labeled as Tartaria on pre-1830 maps contained the highest concentration of temporally displaced, dimensionally oversized sanitation infrastructure. A prior civilization with advanced planning capability could have constructed the systems, which were later inherited by 19th century authorities who did not understand their origin. I could not prove this interpretation. The evidence supported it without confirming it. The infrastructure existed. The temporal displacement was documented. The dimensional anomaly was measurable. The systematic removal was recorded. What was not recorded was who had built systems for cities decades before those cities existed, sized for populations significantly taller than any documented demographic. The physical evidence suggested capabilities beyond acknowledged 19th century technology. The connection points were positioned with GPS-level accuracy along street alignments that would not be approved for decades. The fixture dimensions standardized across a continent without any coordinating authority. The spacing intervals, 847 meters between major junction points, repeated in cities separated by thousands of kilometers. Modern urban planning uses satellite positioning and computer modeling to achieve this precision. Victorian surveyors used theodolites and measuring chains. The infrastructure exceeded the capabilities of the engineers credited with building it. Either an unknown coordinating authority existed that left no bureaucratic record, or the infrastructure predated the supposed era of construction entirely. Built by someone with planning capabilities we do not officially acknowledge. The remaining fragments confirmed the pattern. A stone fixture base preserved in the Musée Carnavalet showed a basin height of 1.37 meters and a date inscription of 1831, 22 years before Haussmann's appointment. A connection point photographed in Brussels before demolition displayed coordinates matching the 1842 survey positions exactly. An architectural fragment in Vienna's municipal collection showed junction specifications identical to systems installed across Europe. The fragments were too few to reconstruct the complete network. The removal programs had been thorough, but they confirmed that the infrastructure had existed, had predated the cities it served, and had been systematically eliminated when the temporal paradox became inconvenient. The final photograph I examined showed a Vienna demolition crew in 1901, breaking apart a stone fixture base with sledgehammers. The base had stood since at least 1843, waiting for a city to form around it, serving users for whom it was not designed, carrying waste through systems that anticipated urban development by decades. The workers were destroying evidence of advanced planning that no official history could explain. They were erasing infrastructure built before cities existed, sized for populations that never arrived. They were eliminating the proof that these toilets were not built for us. The photograph captured the moment of erasure. Stone that had waited decades for its neighborhood was being reduced to rubble. Infrastructure that had guided urban development was being demolished. Evidence of temporal displacement was being removed from the physical landscape. What remained was the archive. Fragmentary, incomplete, but sufficient to document the pattern. The toilets were too tall for their users. The infrastructure predated the cities it served. The removal was systematic and coordinated. And the original builders left no record of who they were or how they knew where cities would grow. These were not built for us. They were built before us, sized for someone else, positioned with foreknowledge we cannot explain. And when we inherited them, we used them as best we could, until we finally destroyed what we could not understand. The evidence says they existed. The proportions prove they were planned for others. The temporal displacement proves someone knew what was coming. The systematic removal proves someone wanted us to forget. The man in the 1872 Vienna photograph stood beside a urinal that had waited 24 years for his neighborhood to exist. He could barely reach it. It was not designed for him. It was designed for someone who knew he was coming and built the infrastructure decades before he arrived.